Hey everyone, in this video I wanted to recommend to you a video that I just saw today. It's called Authorized, the Use and Misuse of the King James Bible with Dr. Mark Ward. The video was produced by Logos Bible Software and it just came out on October 12th, 2022, so it's a brand new video as I'm recording this, and it is really well done. It is really sharing a lot of information based on the book by that same title by Dr. Mark Ward. It's actually the first book I think that I ever reviewed on my channel, or one of the first books that I ever reviewed on my channel, and I highly recommend the book if you haven't read it. But this video presentation does a great job of presenting information based on that book in a very engaging and entertaining manner. But at the end of that video, Dr. Mark Ward brings up a subject that I want to talk about and give some reaction to in this video. It is the topic of Bible translation tribalism.
Which Bible translation is best? Sadly, Bible translations have become badges worn by different groups of Christians to distinguish themselves from other groups. This Bible translation tribalism is not healthy. American Christianity, you are taking it too far. Our embarrassment of riches. All these great English Bible translations are supposed to help you, not divide you into warring tribes.
So Dr. Mark Ward, at the end of the video, brings up this issue of translation tribalism, and he bemoans its existence. And what he says in reaction to what's happening today in regard to Bible translation is that translations are supposed to be there to help us, not to divide us. And with that, I definitely give a hearty amen, and I try on my channel to help people not to be divided over the issue of Bible translation, but to do a better job of understanding what these different Bible translations are all about and why we have these different translations. That being said, as much as I agree with what his sentiment is there, I actually think that the myriad of translations that we have today are not the cause of division, but are actually the result of division that is already there. And so that's really the thesis of this video, is that the overabundance, we could call it, of Bible translations that we have in English is due to tribalism and theological differences that already have existed in Christianity. And so these different Bible translations are really just a reflection of the differences that we already have. So for example, I was thinking about a translation like the English Standard Version, the ESV. Why do we have the ESV? The Revised Standard Version was already updated with the New Revised Standard Version. And the ESV is supposed to be an update of the Revised Standard Version, but the Revised Standard Version already was updated. So what's going on there? Well, the ESV, the people who created it, obviously didn't like the update to the Revised Standard Version that was done in the NRSV. And so they had theological differences and felt that it needed to be updated in a better way from their perspective. And so that gave rise to the creation of the English Standard Version. Another would be the NIV. Why do we have the NIV? Well, the person who helped get the ball rolling for the creation of the NIV, and Mark Ward brings this out in the video, basically had the idea in his mind that the KJV needed to be updated. People couldn't understand the King James Version. And I understand why they felt that way, but the ironic thing about it, or the interesting thing about it, is that the KJV already was updated by the time people began formulating the NIV. And that was with the RSV, the Revised Standard Version. So I assume that the reason that the creators of the NIV didn't use the RSV is because they felt that even though it was updated English, it didn't really reflect their theological values and translation philosophy to the degree that they were satisfied with. And so they went ahead with their project of the NIV. So you can see here that It's actually theological differences and our theological tribalism that has given rise to the various Bible translations that we have today. Now, I'm not saying that's the only factor as to why we have these different translations. Some people would be very cynical and say the reason we have all these different translations is because of money. Publishers want to make money, and that's why they produce these translations. I think that could be a factor, although that's a very cynical way of looking at it. But I actually think another reason we have all these different translations is just because different translations meet different needs. And that's actually a good reason to have different translations. So, for example, the New American Standard Bible, it meets the need for a translation that is very literal, that has italicized words for supplied words in English. It has extensive footnotes, and that meets a certain need, especially for those who are more academically inclined or want to see a more literal rendering of the original languages. The New King James Version, it's different than the NASB, although it's also a very literal translation, but really that's for people who want an updated King James Version that doesn't have all the false friends and has recent scholarship reflected in the footnotes. So the New King James Version meets a certain need. But why do we have so many translations? Do we really need that many? I would say we don't really need the amount of translations that we have in English. It's really just a symptom of the fracturing of Christianity that we've seen in our culture and the different expressions of it and different theological positions that are presented. And that's one of the downsides. Now, I do think Dr. Mark Ward is right in saying it's also a great blessing to have these different translations, and I think in many ways it is a blessing. However, it can have the downside of really causing information overload where we just don't even know how to deal with all the different translations that are at our disposal. And so when you're looking on a website and you're trying to choose a Bible translation and there's 100 of them for you to choose from, I think that can be overkill. Also, I would agree that one of the problems of having these different translations is that while they may not be the root cause of our tribalism, they can reinforce our tribalistic tendencies and exacerbate our theological stances and differences and sometimes cause us to be even more divisive than we were in the first place. It's just another thing for us to argue about and divide over. And so, yeah, you can sometimes have conservative Bible-believing Christians who actually theologically agree on a lot, and yet they get into fights over Bible translation. And I think that's some of what Dr. Mark Ward is referring to. But even there, I would argue that some of those conservative Christian groups do have some differences in theology, and probably their translation choice reflects some of those different perspectives to some degree. So in saying all of this, one of the things that I do want to encourage people to think about is that when we come to Bible translation, we should try to be fair. We should try to be objective about how we evaluate different Bible translations. And yeah, I think we should recognize merit where it is due. And different translations have different merits to them. But there are also things about different translations that we can criticize and say this is an area where this translation is not as strong. It's weaker maybe in certain ways. And actually, I think this is where having various translations is helpful because, as I said, the New American Standard Bible is really good about being literal, but there are situations where a literal rendering is not necessarily as clear or as helpful, maybe even misrepresent something in English that the original writer was trying to say. And so something that is less literal can be helpful and actually be a strength in that particular passage. So I totally understand what Dr. Mark Ward is saying in bemoaning Bible translation tribalism. I totally agree with him. I think it is something we need to be careful of and we need to deal with. But what I am saying is I think that there are a lot of theological differences that gave rise to these Bible translations that we have today. And those are differences that fundamentally we have to deal with as Christians. We have to figure out how to talk about those things And some of them are very significant issues. I know Dr. Mark Ward would agree with me on that. And as a result of our different theological positions, sometimes that is reflected in these translations. So I am a little bit cynical, to be honest, when it comes to how much can we really just look at all these translations in a way that, we're all okay with all of them to the same degree. I think to some degree we do need to have opinions and differences about how we view Bible translation, because it's just really reflective of the differences that we have in our theology. And just as a practical point for something that you have to deal with, I have to deal with in real life, is, for example, how do you know which Bible translation to preach from when you go into a certain situation? So I have been preaching at a church recently doing pulpit supply, and if I'm just a visitor, I can kind of choose whatever translation and choose the one I think is best for that setting. But if I'm going to be involved in that ministry for a longer period of time, then I know that choosing a translation is going to help shape the identity of that congregation. And it can be really challenging because that may not be your intention. And I know Dr. Mark Ward brings out some of the stereotypes of what these translations are associated with. But I think he even brings out that there is some truth to those stereotypes. So on a real practical level, even though you wouldn't want translation tribalism to direct the way that you choose a translation, in reality, you know that the translation you choose is going to associate you with a certain group and with a certain theological identity. And that's a real challenge on the ground. Again, I know Dr. Mark Ward would agree with this, but I'm saying this is a reality that's very hard to overcome and deal with on a practical level. So if I go into that church, I may personally prefer a certain translation or think it would be a really good translation to use in that setting, but then I have to consider, will that translation, if we were to adopt that translation on a church-wide level, would that maybe reflect something that the church itself wouldn't really be comfortable with, or would it just wrongly associate that church with something that they don't want to be associated with? And I say wrongly because I don't think that they should necessarily associate those things with a certain translation, and yet people do. And sometimes rightfully so. So let me give you an example. The Christian Standard Bible. I think it is a really good translation. I have said great things about it on my channel. The tricky thing is, if you go into a certain church and you use that, there is the possibility that there are people from the outside or people coming into that ministry saying, you use the Christian Standard Bible? Isn't that the Southern Baptist Bible? Now, I don't think that's an incredibly fair assessment of that translation to relegate it to just a Southern Baptist Bible, but that is the perception of that translation to a lot of people. And the same could be said of the English Standard Version being associated with Reformed groups, or the New Revised Standard Version with ecumenism or mainline denominations. So it's a really tough thing on a practical level. How do you choose a Bible translation for a church and navigate the tribalism that's already there? And what I'm saying is that Bible translations fundamentally, from my perspective, don't cause tribalism. They may reinforce it to some degree, but really the vast amount of Bible translations we have are just a reflection of the theological differences and the tribalism that already exists. And so it's really hard to know how to deal with all of that. So a lot was said there, but those are my honest thoughts. I'd love to hear what you think in the comment section. Again, I'm not criticizing Dr. Mark Ward. I really agree with what he is saying and really like the video. I think it's a well done video, so I encourage you to check it out, as well as to get his book if you haven't read it yet. But thank you so much for taking some time to listen to my thoughts on this, brought to you from A Frisch Perspective.